Well, good morning, and thank you for joining the Winter 2023 Legal Landscape and Turfgrass webinar series. This is going to be a great presentation today. Brian Arnold from Songbird Landcare is joining us to do this, and his topic is the environmental impact of non-native invasive plants. And we want to thank our sponsors. The entire webinar series is sponsored by the Georgia Certified Landscape Professional Program, which is run by Greg Huber at the Center for Urban Agriculture in Griffin, Georgia. So he does a terrific job. And if you're familiar, if you are a G-CLIP certified professional, congratulations. If you're not, you may want to go to the ugaurbanag.com website and learn more about it. And we also want to thank our seed sponsors who provide additional resources for the Georgia Urban Ag Council beyond their membership. And we appreciate everything they do. And that helps us with legislative initiatives, workforce development, and other events. But now I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and we're going to say hello to Brian Arnold.
Well, good to be with everyone today. Just to give you a little background on myself, I've been in the green industry all of my working life. In high school and college, I worked in retail, went on to UGA, got my degree in ornamental horticulture, got out, worked in the wholesale nursery industry, what was then White Nurseries down in South Georgia, later became Monrovia South. Left that, went into extension, served as an extension agent for a few years, got canned from that. The truth is I got laid off, but I think getting fired makes you a little more interesting. So I usually say I got fired, but so did that for a few years, went back in the private sector. And then I started my business, Songbird Landcare, 12 years ago. And, kind of as the name implies, honestly thought within 5 or 6 years we would do predominantly work around in non-native invasive plants that disrupt habitat and so on and so forth. In actuality, it's less than 5% of the work we do. My reputation has been in the landscape trade, and that's where most of our, business comes from. And I could go into more of the challenges of getting into that more fully, but no real need here. So how did I find out, or how did I get interested in non-native invasive plants? Well, when I was young, early in my career, I went to every trade show, every seminar that I could get to. Loved to soak up knowledge. I wanted to know all that I could know about the landscape, about plants. And I never heard the first thing about invasive plants and the perils that they can have on native habitat. It wasn't really until I was, my grandparents had a little more than 500 acres down in South Georgia that they farmed, and I hunted on that land. And over the course of time, I noticed that Chinese privet just kept spreading, and to the point that it was becoming a problem. And I could foresee it just taking over certain areas. And so I started doing a little research on how to control Chinese privet to protect the property, protect my hunting land. And in the course of doing that research, I stumbled into a website at the University of Georgia. It's called the Center for Invasive Species and Ecosystem Health. So started reading some of the articles on that website, and it's kind of like my eyes were open to the problem. It was alarming, to be honest with you. learning about all the impacts that they have on native species. And so, my hope today is to increase your awareness at the issue, or maybe make you aware of the issue. And I'm not sure where each one of you are in your knowledge of this. But I just want to, I spend, my what I want to do with my time is just increase the awareness of it, make you aware, and hopefully it will, impact some of your choices down the road when choosing plant materials. So that's my hope. So what is a non-native invasive plant? Well, you first have to know what a non-native invasive species is. Now, this definition that you're looking at was codified by the U.S. government, so it's official. And that's any species, including seeds, eggs, spores, or other biological material capable of propagating that species, not native to the ecosystem, and whose introduction does or is likely to cause economic or environmental harm or harm to human health. And I was kind of coming into the picture when it was after they came up with this, but I've witnessed many conversations among natural resource professionals, all working for the government. It's quite amazing how much disagreement and discourse you can have on simply coming up with a definition. But that's what it is. Poster child for non-native invasive plants, kudzu. We're all familiar with that one. It's been around for several years. We know how it just overtakes natural habitat. And this particular shot you're looking at right here, we have treated this land for kudzu, treated it 2 years in a row, got about 90% control, which might be the best that you can hope for realistically. But Chinese privet, my favorite invasive to hate. I told you that I was in retail when I was in high school. Back then, good old just variegated privet was one of the biggest sellers. If you're as old as I am, then you're familiar with red tips. Red tips and variegated privet, those were the two big sellers. And I remember being recognized in front of my coworkers for we had there was some kind of little program there, encouraging sales, and I did a fantastic job of selling this, getting it out there. So I look back, it was kind of funny, but Chinese privet there. So technically speaking, it's not always a plant that's from overseas, okay? Southern magnolia, native to South Georgia. Actually, I think I'm sorry. Yeah, native to the United States and native to Georgia, not native to North Georgia, where of course it has established in some areas and in some cases has outcompeted the native plant material there. Now, Southern magnolia with things like kudzu, Chinese privet, Nepalese brown top, many more. Southern magnolia isn't, at the top of anybody's priority list. So, but technically it is a non-native invasive plant. Where do they come from? Well, you're probably aware that most of our introductions come from Asia. Interestingly enough, most of those come from Southeast Asia. Similar continental positioning to what we have. Similar climate conditions, I'm told, similar terrain, lots of similarities. A lot of other introductions also from Southeast continental positioning. So that's where we got a lot of those introductions. And of course, we get a handful from Europe as well. We'll talk about a couple of those. How'd they get here? A variety of means, some of them entirely accidental. That's happened so much in the last few years here. Intentional introductions for things like erosion control, agriculture, wildlife plantings, maybe biofuel. Oops, so didn't mean to do that. And ornamental introductions. Unfortunately, most of them have been ornamental introductions. Example of, I wish I could get rid of this thing of bar on the top. But anyway, an example of an accidental introduction. I guarantee you've all seen this, whether you recognize it or not. Quite often, if you look into a floodplain area, and sometimes upland areas as well, you'll see this plant. Japanese stilt grass is a common name. Microstegium is the Latin name. It'll just blanket the forest floor. Not supposed to be there for years and years and years. I just thought it was a cool looking plant out there in the woods, but it's not even supposed to be there. And it has, we'll talk about some of the impacts that it has in just a little bit here. So an example of erosion control, Lespedeza cuneata, used for years by the DOT, much less now because of the knowledge that in certain areas it can invade and outcompete the native plant material there. But we've intentionally put these things out there. Wildlife planting. This is another Lespedeza bicolor. Until, I'm not sure what it was, 7 or 8 years ago, the Forestry Commission, you could buy this plant. It was encouraged that you plant it if you had land for, it was encouraged that you plant it for wildlife. Quail love the seed. Birds, several species of birds love the seed. Same thing can be said for sawtooth oak. It was encouraged that we plant those. I planted some in South Georgia, that land I was talking about earlier. So they're intentional, and we're actually putting them right out there in that habitat that we want to protect. Biofuel, kind of a little buzzword. That would open up a huge can of worms right there, but another intentional introduction. We're talking about a crop that proliferates by itself, regenerates itself, very adaptable, can grow in a myriad of areas, has the potential, therefore, to escape into natural areas and outcompete the natives. Again, most that we cope with are intentional introductions for ornamental purposes. If you spend much time in the mountains, sorry, I'm going to turn that down. It'll be picked up, hopefully. If you spend much time in the mountains, and you pay attention to such things, bush honeysuckle, winter honeysuckle, it's just disturbing how much I see it and how it just blanket the forest floor. Spireas in the Appalachian areas have escaped into those natural areas and are out competing. Our good old friend ligustrum here on the right, and I'm sorry the cultivar is leaving me right now, but it's one of the newer introductions. They still revert, even though supposedly they don't, but they still revert. So ornamental benefits of ornamentals. Why do we use them? Needless to say, broadens our options in the landscape. Approximately 87% of nursery stock sold in the USA is non-native, and it's kind of hard to get around, really. How many native evergreen shrubs can you name? We just don't have that many that we can use, and so we kind of need to lean on some of these things. Lack of natural predators. They're not in their native habitat. They don't have the natural predators that they cope with there. They don't, they're more problem-free, I don't know if that's proper English or not. Adaptable, easily established. showy foliage, fruit, ease of propagation, and we'll take a quick look at each of those. Important to know this, most non-native exotic plants are not invasive. For every 100 introduced, 10 become free-living exotics, 1 becomes invasive. Trouble is, predicting which ones will become invasive is difficult. Reason being, there are several reasons. One of which is cultivars within a species behave differently. You're probably all familiar with good old Nandina, Nandina domestica here on the right, heavy fruit set. I've noticed that fruit set will persist until it is fully ripe, and then you'll see them go from a set of fruit to birds just devouring it. But they produce fruit, whereas some of the cultivars of Nandina don't produce fruit, so they behave differently, different cultivars. Some are more stoloniferous, while others are not. I sometimes point back to old Atropurpurea. I've never seen it in fruit, and it's doesn't have near the stoloniferous tendencies that Domestica does, nor do some of the newer introductions. They behave differently in different areas. The picture on the right is outside of Asheville, North Carolina, where Miscanthus has proliferated along the right-of-ways, and you can imagine what a fire hazard that would be. Somebody thumps their cigar out the window, and that's very flammable. And that shot was taken probably 20 years ago. It's been a long time. They had the problem far, far earlier than we did. It was believed that we wouldn't have that problem. And if you're old enough, you might even remember that was supposed to be a sterile plant. The picture on the left is just one in a landscape down here, not far from where I'm at right now. But they behave differently in different areas. They are beginning to show up in natural areas now around here, but they did it much quicker there. That may not initially appear invasive. Believe it or not, this is pampas grass. Some of you've probably seen it in natural areas. This is in Alabama along the coast. On the right is the Gulf, and on the left is this kind of marshy field where there's pampas grass popping up. Another one that we sold an awful lot of when I was in high school, and I'm 57 now, by the way, so that was a long time ago, and never did it show any tendency of being invasive, anything, until just a few years back. So they don't initially appear to be invasive. Reason being lag phase. In biological organisms, there's pretty much always a lag phase. There's a lag phase between the time a seed is planted and a plant arises and, sets fruit. A lag phase between the time the rain occurs and the river floods. There's a lag phase between the time that a plant is introduced and its invasiveness is realized. And for the longest time, for years and years, this was just considered a phenomenon when it comes to non-native plants. It wasn't really understood why there was this lag phase. And so a lot of attention was given to it. And some things were learned, not everything. They're still studying that. But probably the most common reason is simply a detection threshold, where there are small populations with a fast rate of spread, but they're still too small. No one's noticed them. So they're there and they're spreading. They just haven't gotten anybody's attention yet. Excuse me, I'm sorry. Alley effects. Sometimes they lack the facilitator of another organism that they need to spread, maybe an insect for pollination, Lack of pollinators, insufficient numbers to attract pollinators, lack of facilitators, other organisms that facilitate their spread. And we'll look at a couple of those. So many of the characteristics of invasive plants are the same characteristics that we look for in ornamental landscape plants. They're resistant to insects and disease because they lack their natural predators and pathogens that keep them in check in a native habitat. That's getting to where it's not so much the case anymore, it seems like, because we've brought over so many of the non-native pathogens and insects that we're having to cope with. but it's still certainly a factor. They establish easily. This is the Appalachian Trail. And by the way, these photos, when you see the little black numerical thing there, they come from the UGA Center of Invasive Species and Ecosystem Health. A lot of great photos if you want to check it out. But this is Spiroreal on the Appalachian Trail, multiflora rose on the right. On the Appalachian Trail, I mean, most of you guys are probably nature lovers like I. It's disheartening when you see that habitat lost to invasives. The multiflora rose on the right was introduced back in the 1800s. They used to use it for live fencing, and as opposed to picking up barbed wire fence and stuff like that. Abundant flowers and fruit. Our good friend here, Bradford pear, abundant fruit producer. And needless to say, several bird species enjoy it. I've seen squirrels eat Bradford pear fruit an awful lot. They attract birds and other wildlife. Chinese privet here, loved, devoured by birds. It is said to be a very low quality diet and tied to mortality of birds. When there's a hard winter, a really cold winter, and birds have predominantly relied on Chinese privet fruit when it was there, supposedly has led to mortality of birds. Easy to propagate. This is in Fayette County, but in a neighborhood called High Grove. The zoysia lawn on your left with elm seedlings coming up beneath the alley elm, and this is in the mulch bed. Of course, they're used along the street where there's storm drains that drain the water away out into the floodplain areas. So easy to propagate. That's a troublesome one right there. What do they impact? Commerce, recreational opportunities. They have economic impact, health, allergens, that Chinese privet. A lot of people are highly allergic to that. I have a good friend, a natural resource. She's someone I met while involved with this. Extremely allergic. They impact natural resources. Good example of one that interferes with commerce is water hyacinth, blocking canals. This shot here, and I can't see because this darn bar won't go away, but I think this is the one I was using for recreational, as an example of how it impacts recreational opportunities. This is at Grand Bay Wildlife Management Area in Lowndes County, where my in-laws live. And I'd take my kids out there. This is a canoe launch right here. And it used to be clear. They kept it pretty clear. And you could launch a kayak or canoe. Not anymore, unless they've done some drastic work to clean it up. But it's basically just clogged up. So they interfere with the recreational. And that's just one example, of course. Economic impact, 21 study estimated that invasive species cost North America over $26 billion since 2010. Now, I would tell you that number's probably on the light side, and others would as well. I mentioned earlier, this isn't a really big part of our business, but we do our share, and nobody's ever asked me how much money customers had spent on that. So, I halfway assume that's how much government entities have directly spent, but most natural resource professionals would agree, or have agreed, the ones I've talked to, that that's a very light number. They impact natural resources. Obviously, they overtake the native species, block the sunlight, block photosynthesis. They provide shelter for predatory organisms that more easily prey on whatever they're preying on. They inhibit the natural movement of other animals like deer. So they have a direct impact on natural resources. And again, those are just a few examples I'm giving you. They compete with native species for light, water, and nutrients. On the right, again, our friend, Chinese privet, competing for the water, the nutrients, eventually the light. On the left, that's a rather large persimmon tree in which an Eleagnus is growing up into it. That's probably about 25 foot off the ground, I would venture to say, when I took that shot. And I don't know if you ever thought about it or not, but the weight of those vines is quite enormous. English ivy, those vines, it's a lot of weight, a lot of stress on trees. They catch a lot of wind, having that what we call sail effect. It presents a problem. Interfere with natural succession. Again, kudzu on your left. Believe it or not, there's a baptismal down there. It's this old Baptist church. On the right, that's the Griffin campus, the experiment station, where they had a lot of tornado damage yesterday. That's the property that I think was donated to them or something. Chinese privet, competing with the natural oak hickory forest there. And I'm pretty sure that no oak or hickory is going to come up in that thicket right there. So it interferes with forest management. Probably, if your work involves using pine straw, you've seen burns in the bales of pine straw. Usually Japanese climbing fern, and it's said to spread quite efficiently that way by the pine straw industry. But it'll establish, climb up trees, and in the normal management of forest process, which involves fire, it provides a ladder, if you will, for fire to climb up into the tree. They alter ecological functions in the ecosystem, nutrient cycling, hydrology, soil formation and erosion processes. I can get into some detail about that if anybody has questions about that. You probably understand that stuff already. But so native, non-native invasive plants also, in fact, or continue the inadvertent introduction of exotic pathogens, insects, and other organisms, often having a detrimental impact upon the native organisms. Sudden oak death, probably introduced from Asia on plant material and has spread into native oaks here, native trees. Boxwood blight, another exotic pathogen that hitchhiked, if you will, on plant material here to the States. Asian ambrosia beetle, another one. And the list goes on and on. Most of them, guys, hemlock woolly adelgid. If you ever go up to the mountains, hike the trail. So hemlock woolly adelgid a huge problem in Appalachian ecosystems, detrimental impact on the hemlocks there, which further impacts other organisms, trout streams dramatically, the impact that they have on trout streams. Negative impacts to native animal species, just kind of mentioned one. Approximately 42% of threatened or endangered species are at risk due to non-native invasive species. Native plant material impacted. 35% of insects are specialists and will only feed on a specific native plant. Most lepidopterans, butterflies, they'll only feed on a specific type of plant. And if you lose that plant because it's crowded out by invasives, then it further impacts other organisms, the insects that would feed on it, and then the organisms that would feed on that insect. Reduced native insects equals reduced protein-rich food for songbirds. 97% of native birds need insects to sustain their health. Okay. By the way, that book that I referenced there, Bringing Nature Home by Doug Tallamy, I strongly recommend that you read that book. It's a great read. He's from the University of Delaware, has done a lot of work on what impact we can make by simply introducing some natives into the landscape, into that residential or commercial landscape, how we can help native species, insects is mainly what he's trying to protect in order to protect higher organisms, simply by using some natives. That's a great read. Example, good old monarch bartlefly, only feed on that milkweed. The negative impacts of native animal species. Facilitation. This is back to the Japanese stilt grass that I mentioned earlier. By the way, that was an accidental introduction. It supposedly was used to cushion porcelain when it was shipped over years and years ago, and then just discarded, and now it's escaped in the natural areas. It's proliferated. Without it there, well, let me say it another way. With it there, it provides great habitat for this critter on the right, the wolf spider, which preys on native toads. So because of the presence of the wolf spider, the native toad population has dropped. And if you're as old as I am, I can remember actually, being out in rural areas, and it just, you saw more toads, you certainly heard them more. And it's just anecdotal. I know I'm not doing anything analytical here, but I believe it's had a big impact. Introduce materials toxic to native organisms. Garlic mustard here, introduced from Europe as a medicinal plant. Turns out it doesn't have any medicinal value, but it does. It has allelopathic, am I saying that right? Allelopathic roots. Somebody correct me later if I'm saying that wrong. Same characteristic that black walnut has, where the roots create these compounds that inhibit other species from growing beneath them. Not all species, but most species from growing beneath them. So, and because garlic mustard will flourish in an undisturbed, mature forest, which is a little unusual even for a non-native, it can impact the soil, and in so doing impact the natives that we would prefer to see there. There's an example of it right there, growing more of an Appalachian kind of problem. Introducing toxins to native species. Tallow tree, Chinese tallow tree, Triadistia sabifera, used to be called Sapium sabiferum. This is probably near the top of the list on a nationwide scale. Let me go on to the next this is a lousy picture right here, and I apologize for it. But this is down in southwest Georgia. Uh, I just went to a campground where my family and I were camping along Lake Walter F. George, I believe it's called. So anyway, went for a walk, and I noticed these tallow trees, rather large tallow trees. So I walked down there where they were and walked into the forest, if you will. And folks, as far as you could see in either direction, any direction, it was nothing but tallow tree. They had outcompeted all of the native plants that should have been there, and it was nothing but tallow tree. Every stem you see there is tallow tree, and they have a detrimental impact on amphibians, frogs, reptiles in general. The leaves, as they break down, they exude these acids that are toxic to them. And you go down in that same area I was, where you should be hearing toads, doing their thing. You don't hear a thing. Kind of disturbing. Well, I've moved along. I guess y'all make me nervous or something. I'm going kind of fast. So these control methods, I was going to kind of go through them a little bit quickly. And of course, I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have, but I was just going to kind of highlight on a few things. Variety of methods: preventative, physical, cultural, biological, and chemical. The invasive vegetation management strategy: identify the invasive plant, its life cycle and habitat, evaluate the methods. All methods can have unwanted impacts. We know that. Manual removal: physically removing plants, cutting plants by hand or with use of mowers, trimmers, brush cutters, other methods like mulching, girdling, soil sterilization. Herbicides: that's the main one we rely on for a variety of reasons. One, cost. It can be non-selective or have some selectivity, as you guys probably know. Application and time. The timing of the application and the method determine the selectivity. Application can release desired native plants. Less expensive than most of those other methods. Excuse me. Just a few shots here. A cut stump, treating the ram of the stump. Uses high concentrations of chemical. Minimizes the amount of chemical in the environment. Use a marker dye. You can keep up where you've been. Somewhat labor intensive. It can be challenging. We've done some of this, and just the thought of walking through the woods, it sounds all nice and normally is, but buddy, when you got a backpack on you and you got vines you're fighting through and this, that, and the other, it's labor intensive. Important to apply the chemical immediately after cutting. Just a picture.
Ryan, we have a question. Do you have a
Okay.
recommended herbicides for lowest impact?
It really depends on what the target is, what we're trying to kill, what the environment is. So there's not a one thing fits all. Is there a particular scenario that we're talking about? I'll tell you this, and this is just kind of a shotgun thing here, and I'll just present this as my opinion, okay? I know a lot of people will disagree with me, but glyphosate, Roundup, has really taken a black eye last few years on account of all the litigation, the commercials where, join this lawsuit, whatever. And I'm not trying to minimize anything that might have happened to someone or whatever, but if you go back and you research where all of that came from, uh, where the uh, where it started. The accusation that it was carcinogenic, and you look at how the research was conducted, and you look at how others in the scientific community reacted to it. And by the way, look at the way the University of Georgia almost went on a doggone tour trying to educate people about the facts of glyphosate. And other land grant colleges, were messaging the same way. So having said all that, if I could have one herbicide and no other, it would be glyphosate. There's many scenarios where it's useful. Chinese privet is one of our biggest nemesis. The Forestry Commission has learned that spraying glyphosate in the forest in the winter when amongst deciduous trees has minimal impact on the other organisms, has some impact, some phytotoxic reactions from persimmon, but that's it. So it'd be the one I take with me. And as far as toxicity goes, relatively speaking, yeah, it'd still be the one I took with me.
Yeah, Brian, the person that had asked originally said privet in a swamp area, and then another comment was Japanese stillgrass in an area with kids and dogs.
Okay. So the privet in the swamp area, that's a tough one. That just the herbicide would be, if I had to choose one, I would choose Triclopyr 4, same thing as Garline 4, where the trunk, like the image that we're looking at right here, where's what's referred to as a basal bark treatment, where a rather strong mix of the herbicide combined with what's referred to as a basal bark oil. It helps it penetrate, helps it move through the wood, would be one of your options. Another option would be, where's it at? This one here, where in this more labor intensive branch, where the stem is cut and immediately sprayed with something like a Windex bottle, kind of sprayer with the herbicide in there, using, like I said, something like Garline 4. So this is cheesy, but this is actually a great book. Can you guys see this book? It's a management guide for invasive plants in southern forest, and it was put out by Department of Agriculture. I actually reference this book frequently. Anyway, yeah, a management guide for invasive plants in southern forest is a good book to have on your shelf there.
I'll put that in the chat box.
Okay.
Would you please say it again? Management guide.
Yeah, a management guide for invasive plants in southern forest.
Thank you.
Yep. Really good.
And everyone, please do check the chat, because there's some other comments that folks have made that are applicable to what Brian's talking about.
Yeah. But, shooting from the hip, my choice would be Garline 4, either as a basal spray or a cut stump treatment. The microstegium, Japanese stiltgrass, we did a rather large job for some nature center up in Hall County. I can't remember off the top of my head, but it was the toughest job we'd ever done, mainly on account of where it was. But we used glyphosate, and this is what they wanted us to use. It was Rodeo, which is a higher strength of glyphosate than Roundup, but it's the same active ingredient. We used Rodeo, and I apologize, I don't remember the rate. It was the lowest rate. It was the lowest rate labeled, and it did a great job of controlling the Japanese stiltgrass. Did a great job, and I was uh, pleasantly surprised that it didn't seem to impact other vegetative plants there. Goodyear, there happened to be a lot of Goodyear up there, relatively speaking. Didn't phase it. Really surprised me. But that would be my choice, the glyphosate, at a very low concentration for the Japanese steelgrass. You'll hear people that never do this stuff, okay, they'll often point at this right here and they'll say this is the way to do it. You're not spraying a herbicide all over the forest, all this, that, and the other. And I appreciate that. But I'm going to tell you, when you're walking through the woods and you have a backpack on and you got this little wand and you're targeting a 2-inch tree like the one on the right, from 6 or 7 feet away, you're probably going to put a nice little squirt to the right, nice little squirt to the left, and eventually you'll hit the tree. And it just seems like you have a lot of non-target stuff going on there. The only way to get it on it and it alone is to walk up to it and put the tip of the wand right there on the stem and just barely bump the trigger. It's a hard way to go. So whatever that's worth. Basal bark treatment, what we were looking at just a moment ago, good for small trees, not really anything larger than 6 inches. You are using a very concentrated formulation. Quite often it's triclopyr, something like that. Useful where it's not practical to cut. Greater hazard to non-target plants, treat the entire base circumference. If you use one of those basal bark oils like I was talking about, and by the way, they used to use diesel oil for this, diesel fuel. But if you use the basal bark oil, if you'll just spray one side of the tree, even if it's up to 4 or 5 inches, it'll actually just move all the way around the tree. So you don't even have to go on all sides of the tree. It'll actually carry it around. It kind of neat to watch. It'll do it quickly too. Foliar application, that's just me spraying down on that land in South Georgia that I mentioned earlier, that where I used to hunt. Spraying Chinese privet in the wintertime with glyphosate. I got a tracker in there. You can see the dye in there that I'm using. Works great in the winter. Minimal impact on deciduous plants that are around. Yeah, difficult to apply selectively. Needless to say, you don't want to spray it on a day like today when there's wind. You want to do it when the foliage is dry, preferably. Always use an adjuvant, unless the label says not to. By using an adjuvant, you can minimize the concentration of the spray. I do remind people that just like that adjuvant might help it move into the tissue of the leaf, it'll help it move into you as well. So respect those things. Maximum coverage for maximum control, and oftentimes the only practical method. This is just a shot, wasn't that far from here, kudzu field up there on the top photo. We sprayed it with MSM, Escort, or Metzol, are all brand names that you could buy it under. Really cheap, very inexpensive herbicide, and it'll smoke kudzu. And that's probably 4 years ago that we did that. No, I drive by there sometimes, and there's probably some kudzu coming back in there, but it's mostly other weeds. Does a great job, does a really good job. By the way, that same herbicide does a remarkably good job on calorie pear, Bradford pear-like pear, on the edge of woods or whatnot. It seems to be somewhat selective. You can kill privet with it and calorie pear, and at least doesn't harm a lot of the desirables. That's all I got. So, I appreciate you guys' attention.
Brian, that was just terrific. Such great information and really good visuals. I do want to thank all of you today who are Georgia Urban Ag Council members. We greatly appreciate your membership and support. It helps us do things like bring you these webinars and different events, and provides legislative information to you that helps with the industry. We've got a couple things we're working on this legislative session. We don't know if the leaf blower issue will come up again, but we're monitoring that. But and you get everyone gets the legislative reports every Friday, so please make sure you read those and take our member poll, so we know what is important to you guys. Thank you again, Brian, and thanks everybody for joining.